We begin with a quote taken from an anonymous Irish monk in the margins of a 9th century manuscript. The art of writing is difficult for one whose cat, Pan-Gurban, is hunting mice. Such casual yet insightful glimpses into monastic life reveal the unique blend of spirituality, scholarship, and just the practical daily tasks that characterized medieval Irish monasteries. Indeed, we can imagine the scene just the same as we busy ourselves at home with our work, those small interactions, a pleasant disturbance. From the early ascetic communities of the 6th century, inspired by figures like Saint Columba and Saint Brendan to elaborate the scriptoria of the later medieval period, Irish monks left a very interesting mark on the European cultural and intellectual identity. So we will discuss today the lives of those medieval Irish monks. It's more about the daily routines and those small little details and anecdotes rather than some great sweeping historical event today. But I think that you will agree by the end of our time together that these monks, far up in the north, certainly made a great impact of their own, and we are certainly quite in their debt. But before we begin, allow me to welcome you to the channel. If you're new here or you yet click the subscribe button, I invite you to do so if you feel inclined. And this video, along with everything else in the playlists on the video library of this channel, is uninterrupted. It's all ad-free for your enjoyment. This is due to the support we receive on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the YouTube super thanks, and PayPal donations, along with the merch store. And once again, your word of mouth is much appreciated, so spread the word about the channel if you like it. And if you want to find any of those links I just mentioned, well, you can navigate yourself to the pinned comment or video description, or the channel description. Now, with all that being said, welcomes out of the way, let us begin the lives of medieval Irish monks. The roots of monastic life in Ireland reach back quite far, actually. The dawn of Irish Christianity in the 5th century. According to the old tradition, St. Patrick not only converted the Irish to Christianity, but also planted the seeds of monasticism. In his own writings, Patrick marveled that, quote, the sons of the Irish and the daughters of the chieftains are to be seen as monks and virgins of Christ. Well, in other words, by Patrick's time, the devotion to a religious life had become so strong that many young men and women of Ireland's noble families were already renouncing worldly prospects to embrace monastic vows. Early Irish monasticism was heavily influenced by the Desert Fathers, those hermits of Egypt and Syria who sought God in deep solitude. The first Irish monks often imitated these models of extreme asceticism. They became hermits, also known as green martyrs, withdrawing to remote forests, lonely islands, mountain tops, to concentrate on prayer in solitude. Legend holds that some would stand in cold streams reciting psalms, or live in tiny cells barely larger than their bodies. This was their form of spiritual martyrdom, a bloodless sacrifice of worldly comfort, all for the love of God. By the late 5th and early 6th centuries, however, the solitary impulse gave way to communal monastic foundations. Pioneers like St. Bridget of Kildare and St. Finian of Clonard established early monasteries that became centers of prayer and learning. Bridget's community at Kildare, founded in the mid-5th century, was remarkable as a double monastery. That means both monks and nuns, reputedly overseen by Bridget as an abbess. Finian's great monastery at Clonard trained a generation of holy men known as the 12 Apostles of Ireland, who went on to found monasteries all over the island. And around this time, Saint Columba 521 to 597, founded monasteries in Ireland and later on the island of Iona, spreading the Irish monastic tradition to Scotland. Dozens of monasteries sprang up across Ireland in the 6th and 7th centuries, in what is often called the Golden Age of Irish monasticism, and during this period, Ireland earned the sobriquet, the land of saints and scholars. Definitely quite a good achievement if you get that as a devout Christian. Monasteries, rather than dioceses, became the organizing centers of the Irish church structure. Unlike back on the continent, where bishops governed territories, in Ireland, powerful abbots often wielded more influence than the bishops did. Monasteries formed networks or federations linked by their founding saints. For example, all the houses founded by Columba on Iona and in Ireland saw themselves as one big family. The Irish Church thus developed along monastic lines, relatively independent from direct control by distant Rome. And it was this independence that allowed Irish monks to maintain a certain creative freedom in religious practice, but also in art and scholarship. Crucially, these early monasteries were not cloistered enclaves completely cut off from society. Rather, they were more like small villages or settlements dedicated to a godly life. Typically, a monastery was enclosed by an earthen or stone circular wall called a velum, symbolically separating sacred ground from the secular world. Within the enclosure stood a cluster of buildings, a central church or oratory, living quarters, often in the form of beehive-shaped huts or simple wooden cells, a refectory, which was a dining hall, perhaps a scriptorium for copying manuscripts, then workshops, storehouses, and some of them had perhaps a little guest house for travelers. After all, need some hospitality. Well, the circular layout reflected the Celtic sense of community and continuity. From the largest famous monasteries, as at Clonard, Glendalough, Bangor, down to the tiny hermitages on windswept islands, a vibrant monastic network blanketed Ireland by the 7th century. One feature that sets the Irish monks apart was their fervor for learning and books. In a time when much of Europe was chaotic after the fall of Rome, Irish monastics devoted themselves to studying scripture, theology, and even classical literature. So they hand-copied countless manuscripts, preserving not only Christian writings, but also works of Latin and Greek antiquity. Well, this has led one historian memorably to claim that the Irish, quote, saved civilization by sheltering that learning during the Dark Ages. Of course, there are arguments that could be made for and against. But, hyperbole aside, there's certainly no argument against monks being famed as scholars. They certainly were. As for the monasteries themselves, they ran scriptoria and schools, teaching novices, and sometimes local children to read and write. An Irish monk named Columbanus, 543 to 615, sometimes carried this scholarly monasticism to the European continent, founding influential monasteries in Gaul and Italy. Wherever the Irish went, they established libraries and promoted literacy. And by the 7th century, Ireland was exporting missionaries and scribes who rejuvenated Christianity in Britain and beyond. A remarkable feat for an island that had itself been pagan just a couple of centuries earlier. Of course, they did retain a few of the old customs. Well, it's important to note that early Irish monasticism had its own customs and rules, distinct in some ways from the Mediterranean monastic rules like that of St. Benedict. For example, Irish monks observed a different tonsure, that is, shaving the front of the head from ear to ear, and originally followed a different calendar for Easter, practices that later brought them into conflict with Roman norms. At the Synod of Whitby in 664, the Irish missionaries in Northumbria famously debated the Roman Church on these issues, and eventually they conformed to the Roman practice. But within Ireland, diversity on practice persisted for quite some time. Each major monastery often had its own set of guidelines or a rule shaped by its founder. Unfortunately, many of the early Irish monastic rules have been lost or were written down much later. However, a rule attributed to St. Columba and the rule of St. Columbanus, which is recorded in the continent, give us an insight into the rigorous discipline expected of monks. These rules emphasized constant prayer, manual labor, study, strict fasting, and obedience. In fact, Columbanus's monastic rule was notoriously severe, prescribing harsh penances for even minor faults, such as a certain number of lashes for frivolous words or small disobediences. This severity reflected the Irish penchant for asceticism. The monks strove to be white martyrs, mortifying their flesh to attain spiritual purity. And so, by the 8th century, concern had arisen that some monasteries had grown wealthy or too relaxed, leading to internal reform movements. One such renewal was the Ceili Dei, the Clients of God, or the Culde movement, led by figures such as St. Maul Ruan of Tallaght. Now, the Ceili Dei sought to revive the strict spiritual focus of monastic life. They emphasized personal austerity, frequent prayer vigils, and the purity of conduct. The rule of the Ceili Dei urged monks to live as if God was always in their presence, with practices like nightly vigils, prolonged fasts, and minimum sleep to discipline the body. Now, this shows that medieval Irish monasticism was certainly not static. It had cycles of reform and laxity. Yet through all changes, certain core ideals held: separation from worldly life, communal prayer, scholarship, hospitality, and service. From the early hermits, inspired by St. Patrick, to those great abbots who ended up advising kings, Irish monks certainly became a cornerstone of Ireland's culture and identity well into the Middle Ages. Well, if we're going to choose one word, just a single word, to define the daily life of an Irish monk, it would be discipline. The entire day was structured around religious devotion, a rhythm of prayer and work meant to sanctify each hour. The framework for this was the divine office, a set of canonical hours of prayer practiced by monks. In an Irish monastery, a typical day began quite early, often before sunrise. Monks were expected to rise from their simple beds as the bell or wooden clapper called them to the first prayers. In many monasteries, the first office was the matins, also called the vigils, in the very early morning, sometimes even in the middle of the night. After a brief rest, this would be followed by the lauds at dawn, greeting the new day with praise. There's even a medieval Irish text that instructs monks to let thy vigils be constant from eve to eve, under the direction of another. That is, keep watch in prayer each night, but with the guidance of superiors to prevent excess. This is a reminder that while prayer was constant, it was also communal and orderly. Throughout the day, monks gathered at specific times for the other canonical hours: prime, early morning; terce, mid-morning; and sext, noon, along with none, mid-afternoon; vespers, evening; and compline, night prayer before retiring. Each of these offices involved the chanting of psalms, reading scriptures, and singing hymns. The Irish monks, like their brethren elsewhere, loved the psalms. Many aspired to chant all 150 psalms in the course of a week or even a day. On especially devout occasions, some practiced the custom of cross-vigil or cross-vigil, praying in the dark, standing with arms outstretched in the form of a cross for hours. This penance was meant to imitate Christ's passion. One early Irish rule exhorts, "Let your prayer be until your tears come, or until your perspiration comes if tears do not." In other words, don't stop. Just pray with such fervor that you are moved to tears, crying, breaking down with emotion, or at least break a sweat in your great effort. Now, silence and simplicity were also hallmarks of the monk's personal discipline. The rule of St. Columba succinctly commands, "Speak not except on business." Unnecessary chatter was discouraged. Weren't there to socialize. Monks communicated in quiet tones or sometimes developed hand signals to convey needs without words. This cultivated an atmosphere of contemplation. Humility was also enforced. Monks addressed their abbot and each other with respect and saw obedience as a primary virtue. The abbot or prior was like a spiritual father, whose instructions must be followed promptly and without any complaint. Don't think, just do it. A saying from the Irish monastic tradition goes, "Yield submission to every rule that is of devotion." So monks trained themselves to accept rules not as arbitrary restrictions, but as offerings of love to God. Now then there was fasting. That was a regular part of the routine. It was very common for monks to limit themselves to one meal per day, especially outside of feast days. In early Irish monasteries, the single meal was often taken in mid-afternoon, around the 9th hour, roughly 3 p.m. The monastic rule of the Columbanus, for instance, prescribed that monks ordinarily eat once a day in winter and twice in summer, when the days were longer and labor was a bit more strenuous. And of course they would fast on certain days. One account notes that in times of plenty, monks ate at 3 p.m., except during times of famine, implying that during scarcity they might even eat even less, or perhaps at irregular times. Well, at least they'd probably be used to it with all that fasting, I suppose. And as for the diet, it was, as you can imagine, quite simple. Grains, as barley and oats in porridge or bread, vegetables from the monastic garden, onions, root crops, cabbage, and perhaps a few legumes. Many Irish monks abstained from meat entirely as an act of asceticism. Meat was seen as a luxury, you see. Well, instead, protein came from dairy, milk, cheese, butter, or occasionally fish if they were near water. On the remote Skellig Michael Hermitage off the Irish coast, for example, monks survived completely off fish, seabird eggs, and what hardy vegetables they could cultivate on the cliffside plots. Clean water had to be collected from rainfall or brought from the mainland, and every drop of that was precious. So one can imagine the monks climbing the steep stone steps of Skellig Michael, hauling water and seaweed for their gardens, sustaining their body as frugally as possible while nourishing the soul with constant prayer. Not easy. Not easy at all. Well, the amount of sleep a monk enjoyed too was limited. A common guideline in strict communities was to, quote, "Sleep not till thou feelest desire." In other words, don't indulge in excessive rest. The night was punctuated by the midnight or pre-dawn prayer vigil, breaking the sleep cycle. Monks might sleep in their habit, or on simple mats, sometimes even on the floor or on boards to avoid comfort. Some particularly zealous ascetics would sleep very little, or even keep vigil all night on certain holy eves. And of course, moderation was needed to maintain health, hence most rules allowed a few hours of rest, but the ideal monk was always ready to rise for prayer at the appointed time. The image we get is of a community always watchful, dividing the day into sacred segments. Time itself was sanctified by this routine. Every 3 hours or so, everything had to stop for worship. Personal prayer and study filled the intervals between these communal duties. After the first prayers of the morning, a monk might retire to his cell for private meditation, or what is called lectio divina, the slow, reflective reading of scripture. Monks often memorized large portions of the Psalms and Gospels, reciting them silently as they went about tasks. In line with the biblical injunction to pray without ceasing, Irish monks cultivated an inner rhythm of prayer that continued even when they were not at formal services. One early hermit's rule advises, cherish every practice of devotion greatly. And we also see an emphasis on praying for others, constant prayers for those who trouble thee, and fervent prayer for the souls of the departed were encouraged. Irish piety included a strong devotion to praying for the dead. Monasteries would sing the office for the dead with great fervor, as if every deceased person were a particular friend of theirs. The Irish liturgical calendar even had a special focus on All Souls. An 8th century Irish practice was to devote much of November, as around the Celtic feast of Samhain, to prayers for the departed faithful. But despite the intensity of their spiritual exercises, the monk's day was not meant to be dour or joyless. The routine itself provided stability and a certain peaceful rhythm. Monks took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, renouncing worldly ties, but in doing so they sought a closer relationship with God and freedom from the burdens of material life. Many writings from monks show that they derived deep contentment from their way of life. For example, an anonymous 9th century Irish monk living abroad in a monastery in what is now Austria jotted down that little poem about his cat that we mentioned in the introduction. It continues on. In this delightful little poem known as Pangurban, the monk compares his own scholarly pursuits to his pet's cat's hunt for mice. Pangurban and I at work, adepts equals cat and clerk, his whole instinct is to hunt, mine to free the meaningful pent. Well, he describes how each of them finds bliss in their simple tasks, the cat pouncing on a mouse and the monk joyfully pouncing on a tricky idea that finally yields its meaning. He writes, I love books, silence, my little cell, and my work, finding happiness in the quiet concentration of the monastic night, alone, yet together with his companion. Now that's pretty touching, I think. Certainly a glimpse into the monk's inner life that shows amid all that discipline that there were moments of gentle pleasure and even humor, that the monk and his cat are kindred spirits in the silence of the scriptorium. Personal reflections, revealing the human side of monastic life. They were not unfeeling automaton robots, but they were just real people who could experience contentment, frustration, and affection within the cloister. Just like you and me, but a lot more disciplined. Now, the motto of Western monasticism had long been ora et labora, pray and work. And the Irish monks certainly took that to heart. When they were not engaged in formal prayers, they were expected to be busy at work, either manual labor or intellectual labor. Idleness was seen as the enemy of the soul. The rule of Columba explicitly instructs that each day should be divided into 3 labors: prayer, work, and reading. Furthermore, it specifies a 3-fold division of work. First, attending to one's own assigned tasks and the practical needs of the monastery. Second, sharing in communal duties, that is, helping your brethren with their work. And third, to help the neighbors, that is, works of charity or service for the outside community, such as teaching or caring for the poor. The structure ensured that a monk's day was well balanced and that no area, whether that be manual spiritual or intellectual, was neglected in any way. But speaking of work, what kind of work did the monks actually do? Well, a bit of everything, really. That's what was required to run a largely self-sufficient community. Many monasteries had fields and gardens, so farm work was common. Monks tilled the soil, planted and harvested crops, and tended orchards. In pastoral areas, they herded sheep or cattle. An Irish monastery often kept a cow for milk and a few chickens for eggs, though meat was usually off the menu. Dairy produce was rather vital. The agricultural skills of monks in medieval Ireland were noted to be quite advanced for the time, employing crop rotation and irrigation methods. They grew barley, oats, rye, and vegetables, producing enough not only for themselves, but often a surplus that could be traded or given as alms to the poor. Monks also engaged in various crafts and trades within the cloister. Every monastery needed certain goods and was a hub of craftsmanship. Monks became blacksmiths, tailors, masons, carpenters, whatever they needed to become as the requirements arose. And Ireland, famous for its metalwork, monks were involved in creating exquisite religious objects, many of which we still have in museums: the chalices, the reliquaries, handbells for calling the faithful to prayer. The splendid Ardagh chalice of the 8th century, for instance, is thought to have been crafted by monastic artisans skilled in metalwork and insular art. Even such labor was considered a form of prayer. Working patiently and skillfully was a way to glorify God through one's own creativity. But perhaps the most celebrated work of Irish monks was their scholarly and artistic labor, especially the copying of manuscripts. In the scriptorium, you see, typically a small, cold room with slits for windows. Monks sat hunched over wooden desks, laboriously writing on parchment with quill pens. They made inks from natural substances: oak gall for black, ochre for yellow, lapis lazuli for brilliant blue, etc., and illuminated manuscripts with intricate interlaced designs and sacred images. The fruits of their toil include some of the greatest treasures of medieval art. For example, the Book of Kells, circa 800 AD, an illuminated gospel book of astounding beauty, believed to have been created by Irish monks. Page after page of the Book of Kells features ornate initials, Celtic knotwork, and vibrant illustrations of gospel scenes, a testament to the countless hours of patient concentration by its monk artists. Such a project could only be completed in a setting where devotion and craft went hand in hand. The monks saw their artistic skills as gifts offered to God himself, decorating the world of Scripture as beautifully as possibly was. It was to them a high act of devotion. Still, you must not imagine that every monk was a master artist. For many, manuscript copying was painstaking drudgery. We know this because the very manuscripts themselves carry the voices of the weary monks. In the margins of some manuscripts, Irish scribes left behind candid notes about their feelings. These are called scribal marginalia, and they're very often quite endearingly human. One monk scribbled in a certain manuscript: "Writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back, it dims your sight, it twists your stomach and your sides." Another, after finishing a long text, joyfully wrote, "Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink." Yet another complained simply, "It is very cold." We even find a tiny note: "Thank God it will soon be dark," suggesting a monk straining to finish his copying by the last light of daylight. Voices from 1,000 years ago. It certainly makes us grin a little bit, and perhaps empathize. The life of a scribe could indeed be uncomfortable and monotonous. Cold winters with no modern heating meant numb fingers. Bad lights meant eye strain. Quills had to be continually trimmed and ink replenished. The humor and frustration on these notes shows that monks, despite their sacred calling, experienced very relatable fatigue. Of course, they were committed to their tasks, but they were not above longing for a break or commiserating with their own aching hands. After all, we're all human, right? Well, in addition to copying religious texts, these Bibles, commentaries, lives of saints, etc., Irish monastic scribes recorded secular knowledge as well. They compiled annals and chronicles year by year, noting important events, battles, deaths of kings, Viking raids, strange portents in the sky, essentially creating the first written histories of Ireland. The Annals of Ulster, Annals of Innisfallen, and others are examples of chronicles likely kept or initiated by monastic scholars starting in the early medieval period, though surviving manuscripts do date a little bit later than that. Monasteries also preserved poetry, mythic tales, and lore tracts by writing them down in manuscripts, thereby rescuing much of the pre-Christian oral traditions in Ireland for posterity. And ironically, the Christian monks became somewhat guardians of Ireland's pagan heritage, transcribing epic sagas and genealogies alongside biblical texts. The Masonic scriptorium, therefore, was not only a place of religious labor but a crucible of culture, where Ireland's collective memory was inked into vellum. But apart from writing, many monks were involved in teaching too. Monasteries often ran monastic schools that educated not just novice monks, but sometimes lay people, especially boys of the local nobility, were sent for education. An Irish monastic education included Latin grammar, study of scripture, theology, and also more general subjects like history or even rudimentary science of the day, etc. Computus, that is the calculation of Easter, and knowledge of the calendar, things like that, still relevant within a theological context. For instance, the monastery of Clonmacnoise, I think that's how you say it, was famed for a center of learning, producing scholars and even poets. Teaching younger students or newly joined novices, that was a daily duty for learned monks, and one can picture an elderly monk, wax tablet in hand, patiently instructing a circle of youths in the Latin alphabet, or drilling them in the Psalms. Community life in the monastery also entailed routine tasks that everyone took turns doing. Monks would rotate through duties such as cooking, cleaning, baking bread, brewing ale, caring for the sick. And yes, brewing. Irish monasteries, just like those in continental Europe, often brewed their own ale or beer as a nutritious drink. You see, watered ale was far safer than just ordinary water in many cases. Brewing or baking were important to sustain the community, and these two were done in a spirit of mindfulness. Seasoned monks might also be appointed to roles like the cellarer, that is, the manager of the food stalls, or the almoner, distributing alms to the needy at the gate, or the infirmarian, that is, looking after the ill brethren. But despite the workload, Irish monks did have moments of rest and what we might call recreation. The rule of St. Benedict actually allots some leisure for free time. And it is likely the Irish did similarly, even before formal Benedictine customs arrived. Monks could take walks within the enclosure, tend small personal gardens, or engage in holy reading on their own. On feast days and Sundays, the schedule lightened somewhat. Work was minimalized, and there might be a communal talk or joyful liturgy with incense and singing in full measure. The bonds of brotherhood were strong. The medium of communication might have been formal and the lifestyle austere, but monks formed deep friendships and shared the pursuit of holiness. One can imagine them on a rare sunny afternoon, I suppose, having finished work up, perhaps sitting under a tree within the cloister, quietly conversing about scripture or sharing a rare joke. Who knows? Scenes like that aren't really recorded, aren't they? But we can kind of use our imagination when we have those little marginal notes. Like we said, they're not robots. In any case, the integration of art into daily life was another striking feature. We've mentioned illumination and metalwork. To this we should also add sculpture and building. Irish monks carved the famous high crosses, towering stone crosses adorned with biblical carvings that stood in their monastic courtyards or graveyards. Monasteries like Monasticism and Columba still have their majestic high crosses, which were likely carved around the 9th or 10th centuries by monastic artisans. Creating these large stone sculptures would have been a communal effort, taking many weeks or months of hammering and chiseling. The crosses often served didactic purposes. The carvings of the gospel scenes could be read by the faithful, who might not read letters but could understand stories in stone. Thus, artwork in general was just another extension of the monks' teaching mission. But finally, it's worth mentioning the musical aspect of monastic work. Singing the office was daily work too, choir practice, in a sense. Irish monks were known to chant the psalms with dedication, and they also composed hymns and sacred music. The tradition of plainchant, the Gregorian chant, took hold and merged with local styles. Monks would memorize complex chants for masses and feast days, effectively acting as both clergy and choir. The sounds of their singing echoed off the wooden rafters or stone walls of an abbey church every single day. And they even devised unique musical notations to preserve their sacred melodies. They're called neumes in Irish manuscripts. Now, in this way, the monastery was also a place where music and learning and manual craft all blended seamlessly. Of course, it's all for the service of God. The average day might seem repetitive, praying the same psalms, hoeing the same fields, copying another manuscript line by line. But this repetition was believed to build spiritual perfection, much like a craftsman honing a skill through constant practice. Every little task, no matter how menial it was sanctified by the monastic mindset. Well, though monks sought to separate themselves from the world, medieval Irish monasteries were not isolated fortresses. Let me explain. Well, they were deeply embedded into the social, economic, and even at some points political system of Ireland. So to understand a monk's life fully, we must see him not only as in the chapel, scribbling down that manuscript, but also in his interactions with the outside community. Many monasteries functioned as villages or small towns in their own right, and often they were the nearest thing to an urban centre in early medieval Ireland. Local people would come to the monastery for various reasons. For example, monasteries served as places of worship for lay people in the area, especially before the system of parish churches was fully developed. The monks would administer sacraments to the nearby faithful, baptisms, the Eucharist, and so on. On Sundays or feast days, villagers might attend Mass at the monastery church, standing in the outer area while the robed monks chanted within the chancel. Thus a monk might preach or offer pastoral counsel to ordinary folk, not just to his fellow monks. Monasteries also provided hospitality to travelers, pilgrims, and sometimes just the poor. One of the time-honored monastic customs was to receive guests as Christ himself, with warmth and charity. Irish monasteries, situated along the early roads or pilgrimage routes, often kept a guest house or at least spare space to lodge visitors. A monk, as a guest master, would be assigned to welcome strangers, offer them a simple meal and lodging, and care for them. Many a weary traveller found shelter on a rainy night at the gates of a monastery, that's for sure. where the monks would wash their feet and share their humble fare. And this hospitality was not just altruistic, it was religious in its duty, and an opportunity to practice Christian virtues and charity. There's an old Irish monastic saying, "Follow almsgiving before all things." So monks gave from their surplus to those in need, distributing bread or clothing to the destitute at the gate. In times of famine, which was unfortunately not uncommon, monasteries opened their granaries to feed the hungry when they could, even if it meant the monks themselves would have to tighten the belt. Of course, there were also teachers and healers for the communities. Monastic schools educated many who later became secular priests, poets, or judges. Through teaching Latin and letters, monks were indirectly shaping the next generation of Irish leadership. Additionally, monks had knowledge of herbal remedies and basic medicine gleaned from texts or tradition. A sick peasant might be brought to the monastery infirmary to be cared for with herbal poultices or prayers, perhaps a mix of both. And some monasteries maintained hospitals for the ill, some even for lepers, centuries before any secular institution did so. Now, caring for the sick, that was seen as a work of mercy that all monks should embrace. And in fact, later in the 12th century, the newly arrived Augustinian and Cistercian monasteries in Ireland established hospices and infirmaries as standard parts of their complexes, continuing on this tradition and service. So the relationship between monasteries and the political powers of the day was quite complex. On one hand, monks withdrew from worldly affairs. On the other, monasteries were often founded or patronized by kings and chieftains. It was common for an Irish noble family to have a kind of proprietary interest in a monastery that their ancestor had endowed. Abbots themselves were sometimes drawn from the aristocracy. Some abbots were even the younger sons of kings, and this could elevate an abbot to the status of an important political figure. For example, the abbots of Armagh or Clonmacnoise wielded influence akin to that of princes, arbitrating disputes among clans or even advising kings. There is a notable incident from early times, and that's the story of St. Columba, who as a young monk became embroiled in a dispute over copying a manuscript. The feud between Columba and his former mentor over the ownership of the copy supposedly led to the Battle of Culdremne in 561. Though the true causes of that conflict were likely a bit more political, the legend shows how entangled monasteries could become in clan affairs. Columba, who was guilt-ridden, went into exile to Scotland after this, turning his energies to missionary work. Well, in more positive terms, monasteries could be peacemakers and neutral ground in a rather violent age. Their sacred status often protected them, though not always. Couldn't really help those Viking raids, I'm afraid. Rival kings might meet on monastery grounds to escape revenge, relying on the monks' protection. Some kings, after long warlike lives, retired to monasteries to repent and seek peace in old age. Now, economically, monasteries, were significant landholders and producers. A large monastery could own extensive tracts of land, which it farmed, of course, and they employed or oversaw lay workers, local farmers or serfs who worked monastery lands, or artisans who helped in construction. Thus, a monastery might effectively be the center of a small agrarian economy. Surplus produce could be traded back into local markets, and monks introduced new agricultural practices. For instance, some evidence suggests they improved breeds of cattle or innovated in dairying. They were also involved in milling grain. Some monasteries even built water mills and other processing of goods. In Ireland's relatively decentralized society, a large monastery could kind of function as a commercial estate. However, the wealth generated was ideally used for charitable purposes and for maintaining the religious community, accumulating riches for personal use. Well, that was against their vows. Still, by the later medieval period, there were certainly a few monasteries that had grown quite wealthy and comfortable, which of course drew quite a lot of criticism from reformers. Culturally, the monks helped forge the fusion of Christian and Irish identity. They reinterpreted the old Celtic festivals in Christian terms, etc. Imbolc became St. Bridget's Day, Samhain became All Saints and All Souls' Tide, etc., kind of preserving the continuity with the past. Monastic scribes writing epic tales ensured that pre-Christian Irish heroes like Tuatha Collain and Finn MacColl were not forgotten, albeit recorded now by Christian hands. The monasteries also cultivated music and art that influenced the wider community. The lilting chants of monks likely inspired early forms of Irish sacred music, some of which seeped into folk tradition. Monasteries held periodic fairs and feasts on patron saints' days, which became community celebrations. For example, a monastery might celebrate the feast of its founder saint with a great liturgy and then an outdoor fair where locals could come, enjoy games, get to know each other, trade, and just hang out with the monks. A good day out, I suppose. And so for several hundred years, Irish monasteries and monks flourished relatively undisturbed. But in the year 795, a terrifying new threat appeared. Vikings from Scandinavia. The first recorded Viking attack in Ireland struck the island monastery of Lambay off the coast of Dublin in 795. What followed was a century of intermittent assaults that tested the resilience of the Irish monastic life to the extreme. Vikings, who were pagan Norse seafarers, saw the wealthy monasteries as lucrative targets. Monasteries often held precious objects, golden chalices, ornate gospel books, jeweled reliquaries, gifts from kings, or just products of their own craftsmanship. And they also kept storehouses of food and goods. And importantly, monasteries were ill-defended, soft targets. The very ethos of a monastery was peace, not war, so they typically had no soldiers or fortifications. At most, maybe a ditch or a wall to keep out cattle thieves. So the annals recount, with grim regularity, the plundering and burning of monasteries throughout the 9th century. Famous centres like Iona, Armagh, Glendalough, Kildare were all raided, some repeatedly. Many monks lost their lives or were carried off as slaves. You can imagine the terror in a small coastal community seeing the longships beach on the shore, the alarm bell ringing frantically, monks scrambling to hide the holy books and chalices, perhaps burying them or secreting them away in tree hollows, while others simply just fled for their lives into the woods. Well, there are accounts of monks being martyred for refusing to leave precious relics behind. The Vikings, who were unfamiliar with Christianity and just hungry for treasure, showed very little mercy. The monastic ideal of hospitality was turned on its head. These guests were not welcome pilgrims. They were like demons from hell. So in response, some monasteries took measures to protect their valuables. The Round Tower, a tall, narrow stone characteristic of Irish sites, was likely one such measure. These towers could be up to 30 meters high, with a small door raised several meters off the ground accessed by ladder. When raiders approached, the monks could grab the relics, books, precious items, climb into the tower and pull up the ladder. The tower's tiny windows and thick walls made it hard for attackers to penetrate, though in some cases the Vikings simply just set fire to the wooden door and smoked the monks out. But still, towers provided a fighting chance to safeguard the holy treasures. Notably, the splendid Book of Kells, after a Viking raid on the island of Iona, was moved inland to the monastery of Kells for safekeeping in 806 AD. But likewise, the beautiful gold and silver Ardagh chalice, and the other sacred vessels were often hastily buried to hide them. Some of these were never recovered by the original monks due to massacres, only to be found by farmers centuries later by accident, but, well, at least we found them, right? In any case, Viking raids disrupted monastic life severely. Monks had to abandon some sites entirely. Iona, for example, was raided multiple times. Many monks were slain in 806, and eventually the community relocated a large portion of its operation to Kells in safer territory. It was an era of trauma, and for many, they had a sense that God was either punishing or testing them. Yet the monasteries proved to be resilient. Some abbeys struck agreements with local warlords for protection. Others simply endured and rebuilt when the Vikings passed. By the early 10th century, Vikings began to settle in Ireland, founding towns like Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, and many converted to Christianity when they did so. As they settled down and assimilated, the direct threat to monasteries began to wane. The final decades of the 10th century saw a revival of some monastic centers and relative peace restored. The famous Battle of Clontarf in 1014, where the Irish king Brian Boru defeated a coalition of Vikings at the cost of his own life, became legendary in part because it symbolically ended the Viking Age in Ireland. After that, Viking incursions ceased to be a major factor, and monasteries could breathe easier. However, the Irish monastic world that emerged by the 11th century was not the same as before. The constant emergency of the Viking period had affected learning and discipline. Some places were never recovered their former glory, rather. Yet, new growth also occurred. There was a movement to reorganize and reform the Irish Church along more continental lines. And that brings us to the 12th century church reforms and the introduction of new monastic orders in Ireland. By the 1100s, the Irish Church's independence was waning as it came into closer contact with Rome and as Norman influence increased. In 1155, the Pope even granted King Henry II of England a mandate to bring the Irish Church into conformity with Roman practices. Well, even before the Normans arrived militarily, native reformers like St. Malachy of Armagh were seeking to regularize monastic life. Malachy introduced the Cistercian order into Ireland, establishing Mellifont Abbey in 1142 as the first Cistercian monastery. The Cistercians were a reformed offshoot of the Benedictines, known for a return to austerity, strict enclosure, and an emphasis on manual labor and simplicity. They were called white monks because of their undyed habits. Well, soon, other continental orders followed. Augustinian canons, Benedictines affiliated with French or English abbeys, Franciscans and Dominican friars in the 13th centuries, though friars are technically mendicants, not monks, but in any case it further diversified Irish religious life. Let's not get too technical. But for an Irish monk in the 12th century, these changes meant that the old, loosely federated family-run monasteries were gradually absorbed into the Europe-wide networks with standardized rules. The broad focus of monastic life remained prayer, work, and study, but it was now under more hierarchical oversight. The introduction of the rule of St. Benedict, in its Cistercian interpretation especially, meant fixed schedules, uniform liturgy, and a bit less of the uniquely Irish eccentricities that they used to have. For instance, the Cistercians emphasized total silence in the cloister, except for designated talking times, and they focused on agriculture to a high degree, draining swamps, breeding cattle. Mellifont Abbey became famous for its sophisticated farms. The older Irish monasteries that didn't join new orders either declined or in some cases also adopted the Benedictine rule to keep up. Some Irish abbeys even became headed by Norman or foreign abbots, especially after the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169–70, when Norman lords actually took control of parts of the country. Perhaps that's a story for another time. In any case, these lords brought their preferred orders with them. For example, the Benedictine Abbey in Dublin, St. Mary's, was established under Norman rule. But what did these reforms mean for everyday life? Well, in practice, the 13th century Cistercian monk at, say, Jerpoint Abbey lived a life very much like a Cistercian in England or France. He rose before dawn, chanted the full complement of officers, worked the fields, ate 2 simple meals, and observed silence and cloistered stability. The earlier Irish traditions of peregrination or distinctive tonsure were gone. Uniformity with Rome, that was the norm now. However, one should not think that the old Irish spirit just vanished overnight. Many monasteries, especially in the more remote Gaelic-held regions, retained Irish abbots and some local practices for some time. There were even a few explicitly Irish reform movements like the Abbey of St. Mary's at Tallaght, which revives severe ascetic practices in parallel to the Cistercians. But overall, by 1200, the monastic landscape of Ireland was a mix of long-established houses, some now centuries old, and new, foreign, introduced abbeys, all, of course, coexisting. One notable new development in later medieval monastic life was the rise of the mendicant friars, Franciscans, Dominicans, Carmelites, Augustinian friars, who arrived starting in the 13th century. Now, though they're not monks per se, i.e. friars differ in the fact that they often work among the populace and take vows of poverty individually, they did establish friaries, which are monastic-type communities in Irish towns. This added an urban dimension to religious life that earlier rural monasteries did not have. An Irish townsman in the 14th century might see a brown-robed Franciscan friar collecting alms, or hear them preaching in the market square, something his 8th century ancestor, living near Clonmacnoise, would have never encountered. The friars were generally welcomed, and they complemented the older monastic institutions by focusing on preaching and direct ministry to the laity. But as the Middle Ages waned, some of the older monasteries struggled. Ireland in the 14th and 15th centuries faced new turmoils, intermittent warfare between Anglo-Norman settlers and Gaelic clans, general economic difficulties, and the pervasive challenge of the Black Death hitting Europe in the mid-14th century. Monasteries, like all communities, suffered losses from plague, and sometimes lacked recruits, and there are records of some abbeys falling into disrepair or the monks becoming negligent of the strict rule. Yet, other houses showed vigor and continued to produce works of learning. For example, the Annals of the Four Masters, a renowned chronicle of Irish history, were compiled in the early 17th century by Franciscan friars drawing on monastic records, and that indicates that even up to the very end of the medieval period, and just beyond, the tradition of chronicling and scholarship very much persisted. And indeed, you can still find, whether they are still running or perhaps in somewhat well-maintained ruins or archaeological sites, these old monasteries dotted around Ireland. Of course, nowadays we generally don't write that much by hand, and the religious orders are not as strict, but we certainly still have them. Now let me thank my top-tier patrons for keeping this video all ad-free for you. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gogan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, and Gary. Thank you so much. And that's it for today from me. Unless you want to go and watch another video, in which case, well, feel free to do that. Actually, I would strongly advise that you do so. What's the worst that can happen? You learn more. Alright, everybody. Good night, farewell, lots of love to you all, and I'll see you whenever you feel like coming back. You know where I'll be.